IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Shrey Khanna, a host for today's show. In the 21st century, space and its applications like satellite comms, Earth observation, global navigation systems, etc., they have become synonymous with everyday life. With this occurrence, an extremely opaque, what has been emerged as a gray zone with no rules of engagement, no rules of the route. With this occurrence, an extremely opaque gray zone has emerged with no rules of the road and Earth's orbit becoming overcrowded. Narrowly avoiding collision in space and questionable close passes, they have become a real possibility. And proximity operations between artificial space objects of geopolitical rivals have made space a contestable domain. And like any other contestable domain, such as land, air, sea, or even cyberspace, space also needs strategic thinking and broad directions formulated for securing national interest by different countries. To discuss the main contours of the latest strategic publications on space by China, NATO, and what should a similar publication or strategy by India should look like, I have with me my colleague Aditya Pareek, who apart from being a Russia guy, is also one of our space policy wonks. Welcome, Aditya.
Hey, Shrey, it's great to be on the show.
So, Aditya, can you tell us some highlights about that recent NATO's space strategy that has come out, and what are your impressions of it?
Be glad to, Shrey. So the NATO strategy, well, I think it's in the classic sense, alliances strategy rather than a nation's or any leaders in the nation's strategy. So it reflects a lot of things that we associate with NATO in other domains. So, for example, it has this assertion that NATO is not looking to become an autonomous space actor, meaning that it would be heavily reliant on the national space programs of its constituent members. Now, this is very much how things work on the terrestrial domain for NATO, across theaters, across personnel, across the equipment that NATO countries send to the alliance for deployment of these assets and these personnel. And they collectively serve under NATO, but are, ultimately from the constituent members. And NATO doesn't really have a fixed permanent structure that these troops are permanently NATO, these vehicles are permanently NATO. It's always a coalition of the willing. So that is the most important kind of a thing in this strategy. So I have a few other points. For example, as I just said, there's voluntary nature of these capabilities supplied to the NATO alliance. That's paramount in how NATO sees its space assets as. So, for example, the capabilities, the assets that would be provided would be governed by the granting states' national laws, regulations, and policies, rather than some sort of a charter that's with NATO. Rather, it would be the same outer space treaty applicable to nation states, and the national laws of that granting state would be the guiding principles for those assets. So, for example, Germany provides constellation of satellites. It's going to be governed by the Outer Space Treaty 1967, the Liability Convention, and there's going to be the national laws of Germany. And the third point that I'd like to make is there's a lot of stuff about international outreach and becoming a platform for political military consultations. So this is very related to the alliance's mandate on relevant deterrence and defense-related space developments. So the goal behind it, as I see it, is the facilitation of information sharing between the alliance's own members and boosting their space situational awareness or situational awareness terrestrially through the use of space assets. So that's pretty much a reference to space to Earth observation capabilities. And I think the idea here is that they want to build a structure where figuring space situational awareness and ISR data, intelligence, search, and reconnaissance data that's coming from space, they can figure into the bigger strategic picture. And that bolsters the alliance's decision making, readiness, and posture management. So, this is pretty much an reference to how troop buildups might be happening in the European theater, which is currently very relevant. So that sort of a thing would be figured into. So that's part of their strategy. There's also a point about NATO's concerns about space as coming to the domains point, space as being relevant across the spectrum of conflict, and they're avoiding hyperfixation on space. So I think that's a very wider strategic picture kind of a context that they've set in this strategy. Yeah, so they've also talked about international cooperation in the sense, I think, so currently the United Nations General Assembly is engaged in a open-ended working group. So they've set up an OEWG, which is currently engaged in figuring out the rules of the road for responsible behavior in outer space. So as you mentioned in the beginning of this episode, that close passes and a rendezvous and proximity operations are something that's creating a gray zone and the orbits are overcrowded. So I think this strategy also addresses how their engagement with the wider international community would be facilitating that. So there are two interpretations to that, engaging with international fora thing. And I think the final point that caught my eye is that they're talking about building a common understanding of concepts related to role of space in crisis or conflict. So we often get this complaint across the Indian strategic community that not everybody means the same thing when they say the same thing. So doctrines and strategies don't really mean the same to every actor in every situation, and people sometimes use them synonymously, and which is very problematic because they mean two very completely different things. So in that sense, there are many concepts there's resilience. So for example, this NATO strategy also talks about ways to improve space resilience. So I interpret it as something akin to just basically putting up assets which can act as redundancies rather than something fancy. So if one constellation of satellites gets knocked down, there's another to fall back on. So yeah, I think that's majorly what the NATO strategy is about.
So Aditya, when we think of a NATO strategy, it's more likely because not all the NATO members have their space capabilities, mostly US, UK, and France, who will be instrumental in shaping this course. So, and talking about US particularly, I also want to focus on about China. What is your impression of China's latest space white paper, which came out? And can you give us some rundown of its highlights?
Yeah, absolutely. So China is the most important actor when you look at a power that has, just literally leapfrogged when it was not really much of an actor in the original space race during the Cold War. So China's rise is definitely reflected in this 5-year white paper publication on space that they've put out. However, one major thing that I'd like to say is that they've not put much stuff about the military space program of their country. And it's primarily, as I see it, a very civilian focused and peaceful use of space kind of a focused publication. I read the HTML version of it. So it was running around 25 pages or so. And there's a lot of detail, but there's only two aspects to it. One is pretty much announcing to the world that this is what we've achieved since 2016. So they see 2016 as a very watershed kind of a year for their civilian space program, because a lot of constellations on which they're pretty proud of, and the assets that they are boasting about in this paper pretty much came to the fore around that time, and they were things were just falling in place, and they had a very strategic vision of where they were taking their space program for. That's why 2016. So there are a bunch of references about successful things like the Baidu navigation system, which is now rivaling GLONASS and GPS. So They have the capability to look at just about anything on the Earth's surface. And there's a bunch of stuff. So if I were to, dissect the paper in the structure that it's been presented, so there's a preamble. As we know, the Chinese Communist Party likes to gloat and give the leadership a lot of stuff. So yeah, indeed, there's a Xi Jinping quote at the very beginning. So the first thing that struck me was that this is a strategic communication they've laid out clearly, that this is meant not just to inform, but rather to set expectations and that sort of a thing. They talk about there's a section called A New Journey Towards a Stronger Space Presence. So in this, what struck me with the mission section was that they talking about things that would to put the world first and not Chinese interests, which is very fundamentally different from how China operates in other spheres. So I think this is a reflection of their newfound superpower status, if I were to be so bold. And I think there's also that mentality of a rising tide raises all boats. So they wanted to alleviate fears. I think that is why they've put in this as the mission, where Chinese interests are actually coming second to the world's interests, and how they've presented their space program going forward. Then they put out the principles in which, as I said, peaceful progress, peaceful use of space, and that they serve the overall national strategy of China. So they've very conveniently put out they've omitted the military capabilities of China's space program, which is really not true.
Behind China's this enunciation of putting peaceful nature of its space program, if we can go back, when China was rising as a power, there was this, China projected peaceful rise, which was taken seriously by many in US, and then it became peaceful development. So maybe the thing that you said, that they just want to, alleviate fears, that we are not there to harm anyone, till they get such confidence and they can do the typical great power behavior with it.
Yeah, indeed. So it's like a kind of blast from the very recent past kind of a thing, right?
Right.
And it's very fitting because the Winter Olympics is beginning, and that was around the same time, 2008 or so, the Beijing Olympics. So yeah, interesting. So for the peaceful purposes part, so they conveniently don't talk about the 2007 Asad test, which created the most amount of debris possible. It was a very reckless test, and it's still seen as this direct ascent test that was. So they talk about taking effective measures to protect the space environment, ensure that the use of space remains peaceful and clean, and they've guaranteed that its space activities would benefit humanity. So where was that assertion in 2007 when they tested their direct ascent ASAT capability?
Yeah, maybe they are planning to take us all to space and leave us somewhere so that they can get domination over LSE. So, okay. On that note, folks, we'll take a small break. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, urban farmer Vani Murthy talks to Gauri about composting and why it's good for the earth, along with adopting sustainable practices. On Big Talk about tiny humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna share tips on how one can raise assertive kids. Speaking of kids, on News Kids on the Block, Anya, Trivik and Kavya discuss the Padma Awards 2022 and the Women's Football Asia Cup being withdrawn due to COVID. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Supreme Court lawyer Paulami Pavani Shukla tells Karthik about her mission to uplift the living standards of Indian orphans. And on Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav explores the legacy of the Chettiar community and their migration to Burma. Also, just one quick announcement for everybody. Would like you to check out the new version of our Android app. It's available on the Play Store. It's a really interesting take on how to listen to podcasts. Do give it a look and let us know what you think. We're open to feedback on all of our social media channels. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, do remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth really does help. And don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. And we have a number of channels there at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube where you can take a look at them. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. We were discussing space strategy. So Aditya, you were somewhere on China's space strategy?
Yeah, so I'd like to mention a few more points about what they've put in. So they're thinking of one very novel thing that I hadn't run across in any other space strategy as of now recently. So they're thinking of near Earth object defense systems. So what this means is basically if a asteroid or any other threat is on the horizon for Earth, they would launch something kinetic at it and hope that it would break up and not really harm the Earth, saving the world in some sort of a sci-fi scenario kind of a thing. So yeah, that's a real point they've made in this document. And then there's stuff about deep space exploration. Well, lunar exploration they're thinking of pursuing with Russia. I'm sorry. So lunar exploration they're thinking of exploring with Russia in the International Lunar Research Station project, which is supposed to get its legally binding document very soon. So there's ILRS, there's planetary exploration. So they've thought of putting together missions which would have multiple stops in the solar system and beyond, that sort of a thing. So there's also a focus on asteroid mining. There's a point here that says they would launch asteroid probes to sample near-Earth asteroids and probe main belt comets. So yeah, they're thinking of the commercial aspect of deep space exploration as well. And then there's the telemetry, tracking, and command sort of a thing. So that's a huge concern to them because, at one point, China was very dependent on these ships that go to sea and act as, ground stations for receiving satellite signals and triangulating them for the accuracy of their Baidu system and other navigation systems and satellite systems that they use for ISR sort of a role. So their idea is to, make alliances and get actual tracking stations on the ground in various places of the world, because you really need four-corner coverage and some in between sort of a coverage to actually be a GNSS power, global satellite navigation power. So yeah, I think that about sums it up for this white paper.
Right. So Aditya, and I know this can be a little bit of, hypothetical question, because we in India, we do not publish our grand strategy or defense white paper as such. But I still want to ask you, having studied the space strategies and policy of so many countries, what do you think India's equivalent of, strategic publication on space should be?
Yeah, indeed. So that's a focus area that I've been looking at for a while, and I think India should do in terms of recently published space strategic publications. So there's not just this NATO strategy and China's white paper. There's also the UK strategy. So I think I have narrowed down a list of what India should be putting in that document if hypothetically it ever comes out. Because as of now, we don't know if it's a work in progress or nobody even touched such a project before in our defense and strategic establishment. So I think it should be, as the NATO strategy does and the UK strategy does, that they treat space as just one part of the wider strategic context. So I think India's newly set up Defense Space Agency and Defense Space Research Organization, I've heard, I've read some reporting. So there was this article in Times of India, I think early last year, that was saying that they're maximizing the effectiveness of Indian operations in space, land, sea, and air domains. That's the kind of mandate that they've gotten. So it's a tri-service agency. So I think if India's strategy said that their plan is to use space as one part of the bigger strategic picture, as the NATO strategy says. So I think, yeah, one of the pillars of our strategic publication should also be that, because our elements of the military which are supposed to handle space, the DSA and DSRO, they are pretty much thinking in this along the same lines. So they're, if I recall correctly, they're looking to get to systems from vendors in India, which would supply them with capability and technologies that can evaluate threats across domains. So that would include space as well. So yeah, I think it's more about India thinking in terms of evaluating and analyzing threats rather than taking action solely in one domain, i.e. space. And I think the 2019 Mission Shakti. So I hate to say this, but India was really criticized for the debris that resulted from that direct ascent missile test. And I think it's an opportunity for India if we would name debris mitigation as a priority. Because, since then, and technologies and vendors and, operational plans have surfaced in other countries' strategic publications that talk about picking off debris from the orbits of the Earth. So, yeah, we can also think about robotic arms and whatnot in terms of mitigating space debris. So, as far as I remember, the outgoing ISRO chairman, Dr. K. Sivan, Dr. K. Sivan, has already confirmed that this is a quote from another news report, that they're looking at acquiring technologies like self-eating rockets, self-vanishing satellites, and robotic arms to catch space debris. And these are areas of push for ISRO. So as far as I understand it, this self-vanishing satellite is basically nothing but it doesn't leave remnants behind. So hence the vanishing part. It would decay, it would fall to orbit, that sort of a thing. And, space debris, more or less in the giant chunks part, when it's not created by kinetic hit, is about leftover booster stages of previous space missions, which are basically discarded in orbit. Because the early space race, nobody was thinking that we would even make it to those altitudes. So people never thought about what would happen to this junk that would be left behind. So yeah, that's been the precedent until very recently. And that's why leftover fuel becomes a problem, creates fragments in those leftover booster stages and all sorts of things. So yeah, space debris should be priority for us, and its mitigation should be laid out as a key pillar. Okay, so there should be a push for greater space situational awareness, because transparency is very important. Because, ISRO's current ISTRAC vertical, as I understand it, it has a very, opaque kind of a operational procedure kind of a way. So they only share data with international organizations that they have agreements with, and India's own government functionaries. So the telemetry and tracking parts of ISRO, which is ISTRAC, they should really consider taking inputs from other credible sources rather than just NORAD and the UN and these places and their own space situational awareness assets. So I think we should also publish data. So ISTRAC should also publish data which is non-sensitive, because the idea here is not just that people would be able to see our stuff where it is, non-sensitive ones. I'm not talking about everything military sensitive should be put out in the open. Definitely not. But to stuff which is benign, that data should be put out, and it would help us in this way that not only us are watching the adversary, because as you mentioned, the proximity operations, the close passes, they might be snooping on our assets, but we have no proof until we publish the data and when it's publicly available. So the eyes of the public eye would also be on China and other adversaries, which might try to snoop on our assets or, try to damage them. So that's why I'm pushing for there to be a space situational awareness more transparently in India. So there's also the part about setting out to saying that we should also think about near Earth object defense, as China has said in its white paper. So I think, yeah, we have definitely the direct ascent capability in our ballistic missiles and such. So I think it's not out of the question that we can contemplate a military security program where we can think of sort of air defense in orbit. So, yeah, I think it's possible that India can also contribute to a larger effort against things like asteroid in terms of near-Earth object space defense. And the final point that's in my mind is addressing permanent presence and deep space exploration. So very recently, last year, we did a discussion document about Russia's nuclear space tug called Zeus TEM. So I think India has many such opportunities, and India has other opportunities for permanent presence in space, for scientific purposes and observation purposes, that sort of a thing. So India should think of space stations as well. And, it's a push area that ISRO lays out in many media interactions it has. Its top brass lays out. But I think it shouldn't just be about human spaceflight, but rather we should also think of building space stations. And as far as I understand, ISRO is thinking in those terms, but there's not very concrete stuff. They're just saying that from these human spaceflight missions, our technology for the space stations would also emerge. So I don't really see it as very concrete. And I think international cooperation would be very important in that area. So there's Russia's own unilateral space station that would come up if the ISS goes, because it's reaching its end of life. Its modules are getting very old. It's developing cracks. So yeah, 2030, 2035 is the time that I think ISS would be retired. Around that time, Russia's own space station would be also ready. So I think India can take the opportunity with Russia here. And there's going to be an ISS equivalent to replacement program as well, I think, because the West is not going to just give up on permanent presence. So yeah, India can sit in many camps, but not in anybody's tent. That sort of a thing that would be the most beneficial for us on these two aspects as well.
Yeah, right. And, with debris mitigation, it's just that if we focus on debris mitigation, then India can also harness our private industry. And on that note, I want to ask you one final question. How do you see India's space industry and the direction that ISRO has taken?
So major space sector reforms that came out very recently, I think they are a very good step, but I don't see the kind of exponential growth that say, for example, the United States has had over the past 2-3 decades. So I remember at one point, NASA didn't really have much of a plan for sending their astronauts to the International Space Station. So the Russian state space company chief, Dmitry Rogozin, he said that how is NASA going to send their astronauts to the ISS if we don't provide our Soyuz rockets to them? So he jokingly said that perhaps a trampoline would work. So they would jump and be shot up into the orbit towards the ISS. So dial that to a few years, few decades, and there is Elon Musk and SpaceX. And yeah, they've been fulfilling that role in addition to Soyuz rockets. So yeah, they had to, see that to come true. Out of nothing, SpaceX came and revolutionized the private space sector. So that is why the new space sector in India also has chances for growth. But I don't see that sort of a major boost coming to India. I think there are companies like Skyroot, Agnikul, Pixel, which can provide ride-sharing services, producing launch vehicles with ISRO's intellectual property. NSIL, the government company that the government of India has set up for basically providing the intellectual property to these private new space entities in India. So it would get a contract from a country, say, France's space agency or the European Space Agency wants to launch satellites and it wants to diversify its launch options. So it gives NSIL, so New Space India Limited. So it's pretty much a government PSU. So it gives NSIL the contract, and NSIL basically gets subcontractors and component suppliers, assembly suppliers. So that's a very old paradigm that ISRO also had these suppliers and sub-assembly builders, that sort of a thing. So Godrej Aerospace Limited, Walchand Nagar, these companies have been doing that since the late 60s, early 70s. So it's pretty much the same paradigm, but the difference is now even startups, companies which were set up with very little capital are also in the same game. And we have industry bodies now like the Indian Space Association, ISPA. So yeah, they're headed to a very good direction, but I don't think that India's private space sector is going to see that bombastic growth that the USS did. So yeah, it's a good direction, but not exactly ideal.
There is also, Aditya, money constraint. We are a, developing country. So we have to take this into account. We can't match that. But yeah, there's a lot to be desired. So on that note, folks, we'll call it a wrap. If you like today's discussion, then do check out all our past and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
इन्फ्लेशन, फिस्कल डेफिसिट, जीडीपी, एमएसपी, एनपीए, इक्विटी मार्केट वगैरह वगैरह। दोस्तों, हमने सारे शब्द टीवी या अखबार में जरूर देखे होंगे या फिर सुने होंगे, पर हम में से कितने लोग हैं जो ये जानते हैं कि इन सब का सीधा प्रभाव पड़ता है हमारी सैलरी पर, हमारे इंक्रीमेंट पर और कमबख्त हमारे खर्चों पर। दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है अभिनव त्रिवेदी और मैं बात कर रहा हूँ इक्का दुक्का इकोनॉमी पॉडकास्ट से, जहाँ पे इस तरह के इकोनॉमिक और फाइनेंशियल टर्म्स को मैं जोड़ूंगा सीधा आपकी जेब से। हर मंगलवार एक नया एपिसोड सुने IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट प्लेटफॉर्म पर।
We know you love fast food,
fast fashion,
faster payment,
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Dugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.